The International Monetary Fund slashed its economic forecasts last Wednesday. The IMF estimates a contraction of 4.9% in the global gross domestic product in 2020. The international organization warns the recovery will be more gradual than previously forecast. To discuss the new economic outlook by the International Monetary Fund, the director of the Middle East and Central Asia Department of the IMF, Dr. Jihad Azour, is joining me today from Washington, D.C. Mr. Azour, good morning. Thank you for joining.
Good morning to you.
In the new economic outlook, the IMF has downgraded the GDP growth for Kazakhstan to minus 2.7% in 2020 and predicted a rebound at 3% in 2021. Why has the predictions worsened since April, and what do the minus 2.7% actually mean?
Well, as you know, the outlook has been downgraded globally.
Yeah.
This crisis has been deeper and longer than expected, and therefore in most of the countries of the world, growth is going to be negative this year. Mm-hmm. And between April and now, numbers have shown that there is a decline in economic activities, decline in trade by more than 12% globally, and also add to this that the oil price and the oil market went over the last 2 months through a lot of turbulence. And therefore, it's normal that countries who are linked economically to the international value chain, and a country like Kazakhstan, who has an important hydrocarbon sector, would be affected. Mm-hmm. I would say in Central Asia and Caucasus, oil exporting countries were less affected than other countries like the oil importers, mm-hmm. especially those who have high rate of remittances or tourist sector that is important, or they rely on international trade.
We saw the region's vulnerability to the oil prices and how that played out in March and April. Now we're seeing a somewhat stable oil market. Do you think this stability will be maintained, and how do you think that will actually affect Kazakhstan's economy?
This stability will depend mm-hmm. on the outlook of the global economy. Demand is currently driving mm-hmm. The oil market. Nature of the recovery, the speed of recovery will have a big impact. Unfortunately, the level of uncertainty is still high. And this level of uncertainty is weighing on the projections. Exactly. Having said that, I would say countries like Kazakhstan has took the right measures in terms of protecting lives, with a very strong measures to prevent as well as also to address the COVID-19 pandemic, but also have introduced certain number of additional measures to protect livelihoods mm-hmm. of small and medium-sized companies, of people, and allow the economy to face, I would say, the least repercussions mm-hmm.
Of the crisis. Consumption and services output are way down. The uneasiness of the situation is quite acutely felt and is quite tangible. Businesses are struggling to withstand the pressure. People are getting laid off. Some of them are being forced to leave jobs and also to take unpaid vacations for indefinite time, unpaid leaves. We unfortunately don't have a real-time data on the unemployment rate here in Kazakhstan. What does the IMF research suggest?
Well, it's not typical for Kazakhstan. Mm-hmm. Many countries are currently facing a complex situation where they are gradually reopening the economy and facing the risk of having cases growing. And at the same time, it's very difficult at this stage to keep the economy working at a very low rate of activity and productivity. I think what is going to be important going forward is, A, to make sure that everything is made to protect people's lives. At the same time, and this would require a certain number of measures in order to increase the level of support, information, as well as also proactiveness to contain the spreading and to control the spreading. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it may be needed in the short term to extend some of the support measures that were introduced, both on the fiscal as well as also on the financial sector side. and Kazakhstan did introduce certain number of important measures, preserve the macroeconomic stability and avoid having a big impact of the volatility in oil price, and allow all the economic dimensions to absorb the shock, the fiscal, the monetary, the exchange rate, and protect the stability of key sectors, because also you don't want some of the important sectors to face the risk of dislocation because of the shutdown in trade, or because of the negative implications of protecting lives. Therefore, it's a combination of measures that make things complex.
Right.
And this is why it's very important still to be very vigilant and to be very wise on the way we deploy measures.
Well, you just started talking about some of the fiscal responses. What were some of the successful fiscal responses to the ongoing crisis, and how effective is the fiscal policy of Kazakhstan's central bank now amid the pandemic?
Well, on average in the region, in Caucasus and Central Asia, we had a fiscal response that was around 3% of GDP. Compared to other EMs, I would say is on the fair level and the high level. In addition to that, a certain number of liquidity measures were introduced in order to supply additional liquidity through banks to the SMEs. And this is an important step to provide a lifeline to many of those small companies who would face huge difficulties otherwise. And this was done with the support of the central bank, in addition to other measures that were introduced. Those are important ones. It's very important to remain vigilant to see how we control any side effect of those, and how now the focus should be on reactivating the economy in an uncertain moment. Of course, the upsides are if we discover vaccine, or we have a way to control the pandemic or future ways of the pandemic in a better way. But this is still something that we do not control, and therefore it's very important to keep the buffers, produce or provide timely and temporary and targeted support to certain number of sectors, and above all, protect people's lives.
Mr. Azour, what is the inflation rate forecast for the region by the IMF, and what does that actually represent for this year?
Well, as you know, this crisis led to a decline in demand.
Right.
And therefore, in these cases, inflation go down. Going forward, and also oil price went down. Therefore, also this helps reduce inflation. Going forward, the only risk we could see if there are disruption in value chain that could lead to a high increase in certain prices, like basic commodities, medical equipment, or medical supply. Those are important issues to watch. And the message that the fund is sending to all countries is to make sure that we protect the global and the international cooperation on these things in order to avoid having a retention or certain practices that would lead to an increase in prices of certain products and certain commodities.
So in a sense, we all understand that the protectionist sentiments may be growing between countries at the moment during the crisis. How would you suggest approaching that? And how can the international organizations like the IMF push countries for a multilateral, open relations during this pandemic?
Well, as you know, the IMF responded very quickly to the pandemic. We have mobilized more than $100 billion as a rapid response. 70 countries have already benefited from it, and the first country who went to the board for an approval of a program like this was from the region, was Kyrgyz Republic. This is an important lifeline to many countries who were facing the shock with weak fundamentals, and therefore they needed to have this additional support. This is something that the fund has provided, in addition also to support to countries in terms of providing those who cannot afford grants to address their debt service, and also mobilize our resources in order to provide policy support for countries who may not need financial assistance, but we can provide them with policy support, reform support that will help them deal with something that was not expected, and it's very complex to manage.
Dr. Azour, the new economic outlook suggests that the decline in global growth will be worse than it was anticipated. The global growth is expected at minus 4.9% this year. There are so many uncertainties with this pandemic. What are some of the scenarios that the IMF is looking at?
Well, as you know, this is the sharpest decline in growth globally since the 1929 Great Depression. And this is big. If you take, for example, the oil market, this is the lowest level of oil price in the last 2 decades. And in real term, oil price reached levels that were not seen since 1973. Therefore, it's a severe crisis. And it's a crisis that is compounded with the level of uncertainties, because we don't know how fast we will be able to find vaccines and how strong and how soon the global recovery will be. We expect the economy to recover in 2021, maybe less than what we were projecting a couple of months ago. And therefore, it's very important now to address certain number of issues. How to bring growth to a higher level and to a wider group of nations and countries. How to avoid for certain countries to go under in terms of the debt trap or the development trap. How to help promote new ways of economic trade, cooperation, and then how to preserve the international financial cooperation. Those are important issues. And those are the issues that we at the fund, we're focusing on our work. And those are the messages also that we're trying to convey to other global players.
Dr. Azour, what are some of the recommendations for the governments here in Central Asia, to Kazakhstan as well, as to how to further respond to the crisis?
Well, I would say several governments have learned from previous crises, like, for example, the 2015 shock, and have activated a wide range of measures. For example, in Kazakhstan, certain number of measures were introduced very rapidly to protect people and to protect the economy, but also the government allowed the exchange rate to be more flexible in order to help absorb the shock. And also the improvement in the financial sector situation helped also allow the economy to weather this with this big storm. Of course, going forward, it's very important to maintain the priority along certain number of issues. One is preserve the macroeconomic stability, because it's the starting point. Two is to address some of the issues that maybe existed in the past and we can accelerate, like improving business environment. Technology proved to be very useful during this crisis. Expand the role of Kazakhstan in promoting technology as an important vehicle to grow and also to provide public services. Improve the functioning of some of the state-owned enterprises in order to allow additional growth. Address some of the issues related to inclusion and inclusive growth that are very important, especially at the women, youth, and rural level. Those are important priorities that I'm sure the government is currently working on and contemplating certain number of measures. Last but not the least, this region has proved to be resilient, and therefore there is a great interest of increasing the level of integration and cooperation among countries in the region. And this region could emerge one of the prominent sub-regions in the world, whereby we could see new market potential and new growth potential that could come from greater cooperation among countries of Central Asia and Caucasus.
Mr. Azour, last but not least, how different do you think the world will be once we recover from the pandemic?
Oh, it's a very important question, but it's a very difficult question to answer, because there are several variables that we don't know. Are we going to have a vaccine, and this vaccine is going to be shared globally? Because this is a pandemic, and this pandemic is spreading all over the world. And therefore, it's very important to see how science will help in that. Second is how the global economy will change, and it will change. And three is what are the silver linings, the things that we could invest on in order to have, for the next decade, a greater potential than the one we had, or that this crisis had shown us. And last but not the least, I think the crisis also showed certain number of weaknesses in terms of social protection, in terms of infrastructure on the medical side, in terms of international cooperation on those issues. And I think it's an opportunity to step up the game on that.
Mr. Azour, this has been a very important conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.